Hi everyone, Kurt here again for another video for our testing and evaluation in English course. Most of the content from today's lesson comes from our textbook Language Assessment Principles and Classroom Practices by Douglas Brown and Abby Wickrama. Okay, let's jump in. So this week we're going to look at grading and student evaluation now that we've gone through all of our different types of tests and test items. Now we need to look at how to grade and evaluate our students. All right, so the learning objectives today. First, determine a grading philosophy that matches your school's and students' expectations and needs. Communicate to students grading criteria that are clear and appropriate. Calculate grades that are reliable and appropriate to your working context and your own personal philosophy. Develop scoring rubrics that provide feedback. And finally, find potential issues before they happen in terms of mismatching a teacher's and students' understanding of the grades. All right, let's jump in. So I have 3 quotes from the book that I'd like to share first. First one, isn't it ironic that untold hours of reading, listening to lectures, note-taking, writing papers, doing assignments, and going to classes are invariably reduced to one of 5 letters of the alphabet? Okay, second, if our lives are too often controlled by tests, then our educational lives are certainly governed by the grades that are greatly determined by those tests. And I think we're all familiar with that here in Taiwan. Life often comes down to what your score, what your grade was. Okay, and the last one, perhaps even more ironic, is that the standards for assigning grades are extraordinarily variable across teachers, subject matter, courses, programs, institutions, school systems, and even cultures. So these grades, even though they are so important for our evaluation, jobs, future study opportunities, every teacher, every school, every course, the grading system might be different. So you take a course from one professor or another professor, your grade could be totally different based on their own perceptions of what constitutes a good grade. So, the whole system definitely has its flaws, and the best that we can do as a teacher is try to create a system that matches what the school wants, what the students expect, and what you believe in. Okay, so this is an activity that we're going to do in class. If you're not in class, then you should still complete this because it really gives you a chance to think about yourself. What do you believe? This is your philosophy on grading right here. So the directions are, look at the items below and circle the letters for all items that should be considered in a set of criteria for determining a final grade in a course. Now, I'm not going to tell you what I think is the correct answer. This is for you. This is your initial look at what you believe should be included in a student's final grade. Okay, so there are a few on the screen. You can pause the video, you can think about it. What you should do is write down the letter, or if you're looking at this on a tablet and you've got your Apple Pencil, you can circle the letters that you think should be included. So for example, do you think effort? Do you think a student's effort should be included in their final grade? Okay, we're not asking how or why right now, it's just what do you think? All right, so the second stage here is to now try all of the items that you circled or you included, give them a percentage. What's the weight that you would assign to each item? And the total has to be 100. So for example, if you included language performance, which I hope you did, what percentage of their final grade would that be? And then, have a look at all those ones you circled and then start to play with the numbers a little bit until you get to 100. Okay. All right, so maybe now, the next slide, this one is for in-class group work, but the only thing I'm going to say right now is maybe when you were doing that, you realize that it's not so easy to include everything. all the time in a final grade, because if you do, the percentage numbers really become quite small. And then you have to ask yourself, if you have a lot of types of performance from the student, like effort, motivation, punctuality, behavior, improvement, oral participation, and so on, and each one is worth like 5% or 7%, how are they truly affecting the grade? Is it worth it to add those things into a grade? And are they all really observable and measurable? So now what you need to consider is, how will I actually grade these particular performances by the student? So I'll take one example right now, and the rest we'll discuss in class. But let's say motivation. We know that motivation is very important. Students need to have motivation to learn. But the question is, if you included this one, you have to ask yourself, how can you assess a student's motivation? How can you truly evaluate that? And how could you give it a score? And to me, this is an internal belief that a student has, like they are motivated. This is an effective factor. How can you really evaluate a student's motivation? And so I don't think that you could actually score it. At least I don't have a good way. Maybe you have a better way. Okay, so you can think about that for each of them. So, considering all of those that you thought were important that maybe can't be in the grade, obviously we should also have alternative assessments, because you can't cover all those criteria in a formal test, right? You can't cover participation in a formal test. So I want to go back to this list for a second. If you've got participation as part of your grade, then you better have many activities in your course where you are assessing their participation. It can't just be when you ask a couple random questions in class, because that's not fair to the other students. If you have 35 students in your class and you add participation as something to be graded, and it's all based on a few times where you offer a chance for them to answer your questions, but you only ask 3 or 4 questions, how can all 30 students participate? So the design of your course needs to allow for those students to be evaluated based on the performance that you are evaluating. If you are going to if you're going to include behavior in their grade, and I'm not saying it's not good, you can do this, but you need a system. How are you going to evaluate their behavior? Okay, so obviously for the first one, tests, that's easier, right? Because you give them tests. Okay, so other parts, how are you going to assess it? You better make sure that you have real methods for doing that. Okay, so here are some guidelines for selecting your grading criteria. The first one is consistency. All of your grading needs to be in line with your school's regulations and philosophies. So if you're a new teacher, of course, you need to figure that out pretty fast. How much should my midterms be worth? How much extra percentage do I have to include some other criteria? What do teachers in my school typically use? Now, that doesn't mean you have to follow them, but try to get an idea of what's expected, because you don't want the students to hate your course because you include something different in your grades that they feel is unfair. Okay, second is transparency. So once you decide, it needs to be explicitly stated to the students at the beginning of the course. You need to show them, in this class, 10% of your grade is participation. And so if you want to get 10 points here, you need to participate, something like that. Specificity. Show clearly exactly where the grades come from. Make a checklist for behavior, participation, etc. So if you're going to grade their behavior, you need to show exactly where that behavior grade comes from. You can't do it on the last day of the semester. Go through your name list and say, okay, Bobby, he drove me crazy this semester. I'm giving him a 3 out of 5. Julie, she's such a well-behaved girl, 5 out of 5. It can't be like that, because your mood will change every day. it needs to be based on a criteria you created before the class started, and you need to check it like every day. Maybe you have a checklist at the end of your class. Every day you check, okay, how was their behavior today out of 5? And you quickly check. And then at the end of the semester, you add all those up and you get your score. Okay, and then weighting. You have to put a lot of thought into how much each criteria will be worth. So how much is the midterm worth, the quizzes, the participation, the attendance, all of that. And really try to create a system that's fair so that the students who are the best performers get the best grade. Okay, so now we're going to look at different types of grading, and we're going to look at 2 right now, absolute and relative grading. These are different ways to actually give your students a final grade. So absolute grading, these are pre-specified standards of performance based on a numerical point system. Now, whether or not you use letters, some teachers do, some teachers don't. And some schools do and some don't. But this is basically what's your score, that's it. So if a student, you can see here in this example, their midterm is worth 50 points, their final exam is worth 100 points, and then all the other performance. So maybe some of those criteria we showed on the previous pages, that's worth 50 points for a total of 200 overall. Okay, so if you get between 180 and 200, you get an A. 160 and so on, B, all the way down to our F. And students should be shown this before the course begins. So in this way, it doesn't matter how many students get A, how many students get B, it's just what do they get, that's their grade. This is absolute grading. Now the other one is relative grading, and here you're going to rank students in order of performance. So what we do is we create percentile ranks. Now, before we look at the numbers here, I just want to say these are just examples. Now, you can also use what's called the normal bell curve, where you do it exactly what a normal curve should look like based on how many percentage points based on the standard deviation. If you know what I'm talking about, that's great. If not, it's okay. But I think everyone knows what the normal bell curve looks like. You learned that in your math class. Okay, you can base it on that, or you can base it on a set criteria that you want. So for example, in school X, the teacher will just automatically take the top 15% will get A. And then the next 30% will get B. And then done, to the very last 5% of students will get F. So in this way, it's guaranteed that 5% of the students are going to get an F and 15% of the students are going to get an A. Doesn't matter what your grade is. If you got 50% and you are the top student in the course, you're going to get an A. Okay, so I know that personally when I was in university, a lot of professors used this system. Okay, but now you can see school Y, they value or expect that most students will be in the A-B range. You see 70% of the students are going to get an A or a B, and only 1% are going to get an F. So basically, no one is going to fail except for the very, very bottom. And then we have school Z. Look at this one, 60% A, 30% B, 10% C. Now you might be thinking, what kind of school would do this? And an easy example I could give you is grad school. So when you graduate here and if you want to go do a master's degree, this is common because C is basically a fail in some schools, or C is the lowest grade that you can get. So most students won't fail when they're in grad school, and it's very common that you'll get a top A or B in those situations because those students are more highly motivated and professors are not necessarily trying to determine whether you pass or fail. It's just trying to get students to learn and thrive as much as they can. Okay. Moving on to institutional expectations and constraints. So of course you need to consider what's appropriate at your own school. You need to consider their expectations for grading. New teachers, you need to figure out the implied expectations. Not knowing them can cause negative washback to students. So I already mentioned this before. If you grade a lot different than other teachers in the school do, you will become unpopular because maybe you give lower grades just based on the way that you do it. And so a similar performance in teacher A's class and your class, but the grades are different. So it's something you have to figure out. You talk to more experienced teachers, find out what they do, things like that. Okay, now we also have to consider, because when you do this type of class or you go learn something, a lot of the information you're reading is in English. And like this textbook, for example, and it's not written by someone from Taiwan or whatever country you are originally from. So no matter what you read in the book, of course, you have to consider cultural norms and questions of difficulty. So we know that in some cultures, students never self-assess, even though we know from research that self-assessment can be very valuable. It might not be appropriate in your particular context. In some cultures, students never question the teacher's grades. In some cultures, a good teacher will design tests that are impossible to get 100% on. I grew up in a system like this in Canada. It's very rare to get 100% once you got to junior high school, because it shows the teacher's superior knowledge, and it also shows like you have to be an expert to get 100. A grade of A is very hard to get. In some cultures, most students happy with a B, similar to where I grew up. In some cultures, one exam is accepted to determine the content of the entire course. And in some cultures, teachers that prepare students to do well on an exam, it's actually a contradiction. The teacher won't prepare the student has to do that on their own. Now, some of these are in direct contrast to what we want in our classroom, but just something to be aware of. So in Taiwan, maybe some of these are also true, maybe not. Okay, so gauging the difficulty of your test items for tests that have never been given or pre-tested. So this is the first time you design or use a test. Of course, experience is key. If you are a new teacher, it's harder to do. The more you give them, the more you make them, the more you use them, the more you'll be able to adopt. So if you're new, don't get too stressed out that you're not sure. It just comes with experience. You need to have adeptness at designing tasks. You need to frame items that are clear and relevant. Use tasks that students have done in class before. We talked about this already. Use varying types of tasks for your different types of learners. Reference prior tests in the same course. Do a review in preparation for the test. Know your students' abilities and be honest with yourself. Don't make a test based on what you think they should be able to do. It should be what they're really able to do. And of course, you need some luck. Sometimes you think a test is going to be easy, and it turns out that the students are dying. And other times you think it's going to be so hard and everybody gets 100. I mean, these things happen. Okay, so let's get into scoring methods. We've already seen these throughout the chapters, so this is review. We can do dichotomous scoring, which means it's either right or wrong. So a correct response gets 1 point, incorrect one gets 0. Very common for our multiple choice. But when it's something like this, where it's writing or grammar or vocabulary, it gets a little bit more controversial. So look at this one. It was starting to rain, so John walked down the street. Okay, so we know happy is wrong. Grammar's wrong, and I think the meaning's probably wrong too, unless you love the rain a lot. But we can guess it's probably not the right answer. Okay, and in the second one, quick, the meaning is right, but the grammar is wrong. So this student gets 0 points. Now this is where you start to ask yourself, is that fair? Because the student understood the sentence and they were able to write the word quick. They just got it grammatically incorrect because it should be quickly, right? Now how about happily? It was starting to rain, so John walked down the street happily. So this student knows that it needs to be an adverb here, but they just got the meaning wrong. Happily doesn't really match, right? They maybe forgot about the rain part. So they don't really understand. And then of course we got quickly, which is totally correct, the meaning and the form, so they get a full point. Okay, so this is dichotomous scoring. And then the second kind will be partial credit. So this means several levels of correctness. So in our exact same example, now we give 2 points for each one for grammar, one for vocabulary. So you can see here, even the student who wrote quick, they still get 1. 50% is a lot better than 0%. And then happily, same thing. And then of course, quickly, they get the full points. So that's partial credit scoring. Now, if we look at partial credit scoring, the advantage is it can give you more information about a student's knowledge and ability. And I would also add here that it's really more motivating and fair for the student because they're still able to get something correct instead of just a 0 on the question. And the disadvantage, though, is it's more complicated because you need to anticipate all the different responses and you need to try to make it fair so that even when they make a mistake and the levels of mistakes they make, it's fair for everybody in the distribution of the scores. Okay, if you're going to score open-ended responses, though, it's probably better to have a rubric than just like a partial credit scoring key because now we're going to have more factors in their performance. So when you're developing a rubric, of course you can just use a rubric that you find online, but it might not really match your particular task. There's 2 general ways to do it. We have what's called the intuitive approach and we have the empirical approach. The intuitive approach is teachers with experience or experts. They provide descriptors of the ability and they decide the levels of performance. Okay, so I'm going to give a writing task. What are the different descriptors I want? I want to have, mechanics, I want to have organization, I want to have grammar, whatever you want to have. And then you have to decide, okay, so if I assess organization, how many percentage points is that? And what are the different levels within organization? So it takes time. And when you're a new teacher, maybe you go online and you look at some that have been done before, or maybe change it a little bit to match yours. But the empirical approach is when teachers examine the language produced by learners who will take the test and then apply the data to rubric criteria. So you actually have to first look at what your students are able to do and then create your levels and your percentage points. So the intuitive approach, of course, is simpler because you just create the rubric without having to investigate your students' abilities first. Okay, now you also need to think about, is it going to be holistic or is it going to be analytic? Now remember, holistic is just 1 score for the entire paper, and usually when we do holistic, we showed this in the writing chapter before, when we do holistic, whatever score you give them, there should be a description of what that means. So we know that holistic rubrics are useful for administrative purposes when it's impractical to separate the students' abilities into separate categories. So for example, in a placement test, maybe you don't really need to separate their writing ability into all the different categories like I just mentioned before. Perhaps it's just their writing ability overall that you most care about because you're going to put them into a particular level. But we know that analytic rubrics offer more information to teachers and students. They provide better washback. Okay, so if you're going to develop your own rubric, you need to determine the levels. So 4 or 5 levels should be the maximum. And I'm talking about like, okay, in my rubric on speaking competence, I have fluency. But there should be 4 or 5 levels maximum in fluency. So what's the top score of fluency? Maybe my fluency is worth 10 points. So I cut it into 8 to 10, 6 to 7, something like that. And then for each level, what does that mean? If you have too many levels, it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. But at the same time, if you only have 2 levels, then it's also not really meaningful because you're just grouping different abilities of students all together in the same one. So maybe you want to have like 3 or 4 levels for each category. Okay, and then you have to write descriptors for each level. So what the top level, what does that mean? So successful descriptors should describe observable and measurable behavior. So when you look at the rubric, you can actually give a score based on what you observe or what you read or what you listen to. Keep them brief and include what a learner can do, not what they cannot do. And pilot your rubrics when possible. It means test them out first to make sure that they work well and they're not too vague. Okay, and last page, this is our guidelines for grading and evaluation. So some key points that you should keep in mind. Grading is not a universally accepted scale. Grading can be subjective based on context. Tests can be graded on a curve. If you're not sure what that means, it's when you get the scores back from your students and they're lower or higher than you want them to be. And so you may change everyone's scores up or down in order to reach an average that you deem or the school deems acceptable. Grades reflect an institution's philosophy. Cross-cultural variation in grading philosophy should be understood. Tests do not always yield an expected level of difficulty. As I mentioned, tests can be scored using rubrics or scoring keys, and letter grades do not mean the same thing to all people. All right, thank you everyone for your attention today. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.